Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I am delighted to welcome all of you to the President's Distinguished Lecture Series. Usually in these lectures, we either have a very attractive, timely topic or a phenomenal speaker, and as a result, these lecture series have become very popular. Today, we've got both. We've got a topic that generates a tremendous amount of interest in different circles, and a phenomenal speaker. So I'm looking at the number of participants, and as of this moment, we have 174 participants, and the numbers keep going up. When this lecture series was launched in 2012, I never envisioned that we would be holding any of the lectures in a virtual format. But this year has been a very unusual year. We've seen many plans append, and I am immensely grateful to Dr. Ralph Izzo, who was actually scheduled to present this lecture in April, many months ago, for agreeing to shift to a virtual platform. I'm also very pleased that so many faculty, staff, students, alumni, and special guests, and now it's 179 of them, have joined us for today's thought-provoking presentation. As you can see on the slide that is on the screen right now, we've been honored to host some of the most influential scientists, technologists, policymakers, and business leaders of our time to present a wide range of truly fascinating topics that increase our knowledge and spark our interest in technological advancements that are shaping 21st century society. Presentations on topics such as emerging technologies, innovation and economy, cancer research, investment management, national security, artificial intelligence and machine learning, and future energy systems have advanced our understanding and served as a catalyst for further discussion and debate. Today, for the 14th installment of the President's Distinguished Lecture Series, we are honored and delighted to welcome Dr. Ralph Izzo, Chairman, President, CEO of Pseg, for an insightful look at global climate change and the actions we must take now to achieve a low and hopefully eventually no carbon future. Let me say a few words about Pseg and the relationship between Pseg and Stevens. Stevens and Pseg have enjoyed a long, rich, and multifaceted partnership which began approximately 40 years ago, when Pseg was the first organization to fund Stevens' science and math outreach programs. Amazing insight that they had 40 years ago. Our partnership has expanded in recent years through their direct involvement in and support of the award-winning Solar Decathlon project. Dr. Izzo remembers that. And more recently, a program that provided philanthropic support for advanced energy research and innovation, development of STEM talent through our pre-college programs, community cultural programs, and also the onstage at Stevens classical music performances. While we're immensely grateful for Pseg's philanthropic support, I should also note that Pseg has been an active campus recruitment partner for a long time, and consistently attending career fairs, participating in the internship and cooperative education programs, and hosting Stevens students on site to learn about the energy industry. Since 2011 alone, dozens of Stevens students have been hired for internships, co-op opportunities, and full-time employment at Pseg. A couple words about Dr. Izzo. Dr. Izzo has been Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Public Service Enterprise Group Incorporated, or Pseg for short, since April 2007. He's been the company's President and Chief Operating Officer and a member of the Board of Directors of Pseg since October of 2006. Previously, Dr. Izzo held a number of executive positions within Pseg's family of companies, and he is a well-known leader within the utility industry, as well as the public policy arena. He's frequently asked to testify before Congress and speak to organizations on matters pertaining to national energy policy. Dr. Izzo received his Bachelor of Science and Master of Science degrees in Mechanical Engineering and his Doctor of Philosophy degree in Applied Physics from Columbia University. He also received a Master of Business Administration degree with a concentration in finance from the Rutgers Graduate School of Management. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a virtual but huge round of applause and in welcoming Dr. Ralph Izzo. Ralph, take it away from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nariman, for those kind words. So good afternoon, everyone. First, let me say how happy I am to be with all of you today, albeit from a remote location, rather than spending time with you face-to-face on the Stevens campus. These have been incredibly challenging times for everyone. The COVID-19 pandemic has touched all of us in different ways. And quite sincerely, my heart goes out to anyone whose life has been affected by the virus. It probably has become a bit of a cliche to say that we're all in this together, but I find those words to be as true today as they were when this first began. And for us, that was back in March. So I am genuinely honored to take part in the President's Distinguished Lecture Series. And much as Nariman already said, we at PSEG are incredibly proud of the longstanding relationship we have with Stevens. And I do think it's a partnership that is unquestionably one of our company's most prized relationships because it benefits both of our organizations tremendously. I won't go through some of the things that are typical of that relationship because Nariman did such a great job of already describing them. So just to begin the conversation, while it may not seem directly related, there are in fact a number of common threads that link the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change, the topic for today. First of all, there's the need to rely on scientific expertise. Secondly, there are threats to national economies and vulnerable communities. And perhaps the most significant, the opportunity to come together to tackle a global problem and to do so in a way that builds stronger relationships, creates jobs, and rebuilds economies. But unfortunately, the pandemic has also helped to reveal how massive that task can be and how bad we are at getting it done. So one noteworthy effect of the coronavirus pandemic and stay-at-home orders that brought economies to a standstill has been a significant reduction in carbon emissions. For the first week in April, which is really when it went into full implementation, certainly in the Northeast, daily global emissions were 17% below the same week a year ago. Because let's face it, Europe was in full grips of the virus and a good part of American population, of the US population was as well. So now the short-term drops have been significant, but they are still far short of the substantial carbon reductions that will be needed to meet the world's 2050 climate goals. And I think we can all agree, we don't want to meet those goals in this manner. So if we're going to make a sustained and meaningful set of cuts in greenhouse gas emissions, we'll need to continue our pre-pandemic efforts to decarbonize the energy sector. Now, I am on record, as I have been for at least the past decade, saying that global climate change is the preeminent challenge of our time. I am certainly not alone in that opinion. It's shared by a majority of the scientific community and a growing percentage of the population. I'm quite certain that it's an opinion that's also shared by a number of people participating in today's presentation. I don't want to take that for granted. I'm sure you'll let me know in the Q&A if I misread that. But despite loud and repeated warnings that we have a limited window within which we must make drastic changes and cuts to global climate emissions, we are on pace to fall far short of what it takes to secure our future. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has warned that we must limit global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030 in order to avoid the most drastic impacts of climate change. And to do that, we would need to achieve drastic worldwide reductions in emission of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. Are we rising to the challenge? Even if every nation met the goals they set for themselves after the Paris Accords, we would be on track to limit warming to only 3 degrees Celsius. Next slide, please. So the prospect of success, a 1.5 degrees increase, comes with forecasts for such dangerous impacts as rising sea level, increasingly frequent occurrences of extreme weather events such as storms, fire and flooding, heat waves, polar vortexes, food shortages, and other crises. Meanwhile, our global climate emissions are actually moving in the wrong direction. In 2019, worldwide carbon emissions rose to yet another record high, despite a 2% reduction in emissions here in the US. Obviously, we need to do more. Next slide, please. The energy sector is second only to transportation as a source of carbon emissions, and therefore it has an opportunity to have a significant impact on worldwide carbon reduction. Historically in energy, we've taken an all-of-the-above approach to supplying electricity to the grid to ensure reliability. This has meant investing in a mix of various ways to generate electricity: coal, oil, nuclear, natural gas, hydroelectric, solar, whatever we could do to enhance the reliability of our electric system. Today, to address climate change, we'll need to rely on the same kind of all-of-the-above approach to add as little carbon as possible to the atmosphere, with a goal of net zero carbon emissions by mid-century. Last year, Pseg announced its own carbon reduction goal, whereby we will cut 80% of our power fleet's carbon emissions by 2046, with the vision that, with the right public policies and new technologies in place and changes to consumer behavior, we can achieve full net zero reduction by 2050. And I'm proud to tell you that there have been some actions we've taken over the past few weeks that will virtually guarantee that we meet that target well ahead of schedule. So we're confident we can achieve these goals by taking a number of steps, namely investing in generation sources that are carbon-free, and I'll speak more about that in a little while, and divesting of our interests in carbon-heavy coal plants, which we have already done, and soon we'll be divesting of our interests in fairly carbon-light, but nonetheless carbon-emitting gas plants. And that will ensure that Pseg will be a zero carbon emitter well in advance of the timetable we set. Now, closing or selling fossil fuel units looks good for our company's carbon profile. But if that power plant is still burning fossil fuels, the climate doesn't care whether Pseg owns it or some other company does. And that's why we say there do need to be technology advances, primarily in this arena, in the category of carbon capture and storage, to make sure that the consumer benefits associated in particular with natural gas can still be realized while we don't continue to emit the carbon associated with that. Now, the climate challenge is bigger than any single company, Pseg included, and success is going to require our cooperation and progress towards a common goal. And it's going to require much more than saying goodbye to coal or natural gas. Today, I'd like to share with you 5 things that I believe we need to do, and more, if we're going to have a chance to meet worldwide carbon reduction goals and avoid the most damaging impacts of climate change. Now, despite the urgency of the climate crisis we face, change is often a tough sell, especially when it comes at a cost. Next slide, please. So, if I may, when I do this in person, it's much more effective. So I won't be able to tell what your answer is to the following pop quiz. And by the way, it's not a quiz that will test your knowledge of science, technology, public policy, or anything of that sort. It's a quiz that will test your honesty or your candor, let me put it that way. If you would just think for a moment, how many folks in the audience woke up this morning saying to themselves, I can't wait to use a kilowatt hour of electricity? Whenever I do this live and with an audience completely visible to me, the answer is no one. And I freely admit that despite the fact that I check the share price of our stock far too often, I don't wake up in the morning eager to use another kilowatt hour of electricity. I might be interested in watching a presidential debate. I might be interested in watching some baseball playoffs. I might be interested in sitting under a lamp and reading a good book. I am interested in doing a bunch of things that require electricity, but not in the consumption of electricity itself. So at Pseg, we have a 3-part vision of the future. largely motivated by climate change. Part one is that people would be happy to use less energy as long as it did not impact their way of life negatively. Number two is that the energy that they want to have supplied for them after they've reduced what they need should be cleaner than ever before. Cleaner from traditional pollutants like acid rain gases, like mercury, like fine particulate matters, and also today, free from carbon emissions. And number three, that reduced amount of electricity that is being produced and delivered more and being produced more reliably than ever before will be delivered with unsurpassed, unparalleled reliability and resiliency. And in fact, COVID-19 will contribute to that, as many of us post-COVID continue to work from home or remote locations, where the reliability to a household is quite different than the reliability to a commercial office complex or a commercial downtown center. So use less, have it be supplied more in a cleaner way and delivered more reliably than ever before. So use less, have it cleaner, and have it delivered more reliably than ever before. So with that in mind, I will, if you're hearing an obnoxious noise in the back, that is a cat of mine, that the days of COVID have introduced all manner of exciting nuances to our life. And hopefully I'll have somebody in my family take care of that in a moment for us. So doing these things, however, is an even tougher sell when it means potentially raising prices on a product that has been priced so low for years, and a product that is really a means to an end and not an end in and of itself. But thanks to the shale gas revolution, driving the low price of natural gas lower and lower, power prices are in historically low territory and are expected to continue to decline over the next 3 years. The trend has even outpaced forecasts, as shown on this slide here. Yeah, here we go. Thank you. That's the right one. So even as we have predicted that power prices would fall, they have fallen even farther. So here you just see 3 years of data from 18, 19, and 20, where the forward price curve for electricity prices was expected to go down slightly, but it went down farther than anyone ever expected, just because of the advances in natural gas turbine technologies and in natural gas extraction from shale deposits. So now let me be clear, I'm not complaining about inexpensive energy. That's a very positive thing. Low energy prices promote economic development, consumer satisfaction, and even as we're trying, as they prove, trying for those of us in the power sector. This is a good thing for consumers. But most of the solutions I'll discuss today come with a cost to implement. And energy prices are just one reference point for our conversation. We'll talk about some other components in a moment. So it is unrealistic to discuss solutions to a challenge of this scale without discussing these costs, because they are sizable in some cases, and it's a real measurable obstacle to any plan. Lastly, all of the above should not be inferred to mean all at equal measure. Not all solutions are created equally. So with that, let's take a look at these 5 things. Next slide, please. You may or may not have heard of the concept of carbon pricing, or putting a price on carbon. So I'll start with the definition of what that means. In the energy sector, a price on carbon is a value. It's a dollar amount that we apply to a power plant's carbon emissions as a way to charge that plant for the emissions it produces. And by doing so, to encourage generation from power plants with lower carbon emissions. This can come in many forms. They could come in the form of a tax or something commonly referred to as cap and trade. Next slide, please. In 2017, the National Academy of Sciences determined that based upon a series of research papers that they viewed to be quite credible, that the social impacts of carbon are worth approximately $50 per ton of carbon emitted. Now let me show you how that might work using as an example nuclear energy, which generates electricity without emitting carbon dioxide, and natural gas, which obviously is a fossil fuel and therefore is a carbon emitter, although it does emit much less carbon than coal. Next slide, please. Today's national average market price for a megawatt hour of nuclear power, I shouldn't call it a market price, the cost to produce a megawatt hour of nuclear power is roughly $32. Compare that to today's most efficient natural gas plant, which can generate power for as low as $13 per megawatt hour, assuming a natural gas price of about $2.50 per MMBTU, which is typically where the market tends to trade. Now that's an enormous difference that gives gas a tremendous advantage in today's markets. But that's without a price on carbon. Now, if we just take the National Academy of Sciences figure of $50 per ton, and just for simple math, assume that natural gas produces half a ton of carbon per megawatt hour, some natural gas plants produce more, some less, then the carbon price would add about $25 per megawatt hour to the price of electricity coming from natural gas. That means that a natural gas power plant, when accounting for its impact on society, would cost at least $38 per megawatt hour compared with $32 for nuclear. So suddenly, instead of nuclear losing out to these natural gas plants, would be winning out over these natural gas plants. So you see, in a marketplace that values attributes beyond short-term costs, what the economists will typically call externalities, natural gas is actually more expensive than nuclear. But without the carbon price being valued, it only appears less expensive. Next slide, please. So today, individual states or regions attempt to apply the equivalent of a carbon price to energy sales. Sadly, they do this, though, with inconsistent, sometimes crazy results. In New Jersey, for example, and I'm going to pick on New Jersey because I know it best, but rest assured, what I'm saying about New Jersey can be said about virtually every other state in the nation. The price of carbon can cost anywhere from $0 to $400 per ton of carbon removed, depending upon the details of the technology we're discussing. Now, a nationwide price on carbon would allow us to do away with today's confusing collection of prices and state subsidy programs that are applied somewhat haphazardly to the various sources of electricity in this country, usually solar and wind, and allow generators to better compete in markets that value only short-term costs, but also the attributes that our customers tell us are important, such as lower carbon emissions and a reduced impact on the climate and the environment. So one visible, transparent price would allow the market to operate efficiently and allow the right solutions to be selected in locations where they are most suitable to be applied. So now let's talk about what those 4 solutions might look like, and just assume that the visible price on carbon would determine where they would be applied and where they wouldn't be applied. So let's start with renewables, as I've already mentioned a moment ago, with the next slide, please. So states, cities, and corporations are on record demanding 100% renewable power supplies in the coming years. And green energy has in fact created millions of American jobs, and it's one of the few issues on which you can find broad bipartisan support, with nearly 90% of Americans, regardless of political affiliation, in favor of building more solar and wind. Now, as CEO of the largest solar energy company in New Jersey, and I say that with pride, I believe wholeheartedly in renewable energy and its part in our carbon-constrained energy future. PSEG has invested nearly $2 billion to develop grid-connected solar farms in New Jersey and around the country, and to help finance our customers' private rooftop solar arrays. It's not just solar. PSEG is also working with Ørsted, the worldwide leader in offshore wind development, to assess an opportunity to invest in a project called Ocean Wind, which was recently awarded a contract to build 1,100 megawatts of offshore wind capacity off the coast of New Jersey. So we are, in fact, enthusiastic supporters of the plan by the governor of New Jersey, Governor Murphy, who wants to make New Jersey a national leader in offshore wind and enable an entirely carbon-free energy supply in 2050. And they are, in fact, some of the most ambitious energy goals in the United States. But I'm also cautious about the costs and the pace at which this can take place. The sun and the wind may be free, but converting both of them to electricity most certainly is not. Next slide, please. So renewable energy today, at least in states like New Jersey, which lack the natural solar and wind resources found in other regions of the country, and also lack the land space, need to be heavily subsidized. That means customers in this state for solar energy are paying as much as $400 per ton of carbon avoided for some types of solar energy. What you see on this slide is the cost of what's called a solar renewable energy credit. So this is a regulatory fabrication that is created in order to make it economic for someone to develop a solar system in New Jersey to meet our regulatorily mandated renewable portfolio standard. These are prices that New Jerseyans pay above and beyond the cost of electricity associated from the output. So for the last few years, I'd say it's at least 2, it may be 3. I haven't seen the 2020 numbers year to date. New Jerseyans have been spending on average $600 million to subsidize solar energy, mostly on rooftops of above average income customers. And solar energy in the state accounts for less than 5% of the electricity we use. So this is a massive subsidization of solar. It's not a knock against solar. It is a question as to whether or not, if we were to have a visible price on carbon, such as the $50 per ton that the National Academy calls for, whether or not we wouldn't question the economic viability of solar in New Jersey. Next slide, please. For offshore wind, that cost that I mentioned a moment ago of $400 per ton is much less. It's only $100 per ton. And that's because offshore wind only has a subsidy of about $50 to $60 above the market price in the form of a guaranteed payment from the state of New Jersey to offshore wind developers. So now, to be clear, the cost of solar and wind energy are falling. And that's largely from a cost that was extremely high to one that's still pretty high. They're still quite expensive. Now, the solar subsidy of $600 million per year, it took us 15 years to develop that level of subsidization. Just the 1.1 gigawatt facility alone that I mentioned a moment ago, at current power prices versus the contracted price that was granted to them, will result in an additional $300 million per year subsidy coming from consumers. The state has aspirations for building 7.5 gigawatts. I would assume the prices will decline and that we won't be paying 7.5 times 300 million a year in subsidies. But to be sure, this will be another $1 billion or so in subsidies that will be required to be paid. So in addition to the cost, a major hurdle in the widespread large-scale adoption of renewables remains their intermittency. They simply do not produce electricity at night, from the sun, nor when the wind fails to blow. And that's a problem for a world that demands uninterrupted around-the-clock access to power. Of course, energy storage will allow us to store electricity that is generated when the sun and the wind resources are available to us, and to be able to use that electricity when they are not. But it is still an emerging technology, and we're years away from a time when storage will be widely available at a scale or at a price that is economically viable and not just adding to the level of subsidization I mentioned a moment ago. So despite decades of investment and hundreds of billions of dollars in public incentives, solar and wind in 2018 still only accounted for about 8% of US electric generation. Now, having said that, with a visible price on carbon, there is no doubt in my mind that solar and wind will be very vibrant, extremely competitive economic decisions in parts of the Southwest, in parts of the Great Plains states, where the wind resources and solar resources are quite available and quite strong. And I think in the interest of just pausing for a moment to see if there are any questions at this point, we're a little past the halfway mark in my remarks. And I think perhaps if there are any questions there, we could take a few, and I might also just grab something so the raspiness in my voice is mitigated a bit.
And you can take care of the cat. Ralph, can you hear me?
I can, yes, thank you.
Very good. Well, this is fascinating. Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to ask you a few questions. I've got a whole bunch, but we don't have time to get all of these questions answered at this moment. But let me ask you a few, and I'll stop when you think it's enough and you should proceed with the rest of the talk. So this question comes from one of our faculty members who has conducted an analysis of a number of renowned global media outlets. And as a result of that study, they've determined that there is agreement among scientists about causes and consequences of climate change. But the percentage of agreement between 1990 and 2012 was 95%. In other words, 95% of the scientists agreed with one another, 5% of them did not. But between 2012 and 2016, apparently that percentage declined to 73%. So he's saying, any insight?
Well, without having read the article, my assumption would be that as we became more knowledgeable about the mechanisms involved in climate change, that perhaps where the disagreement took place was that some might have said it's the loss of the ice sheets and the reflective power of that that's more of a problem than the lack of transmittal capability that results from changing the opacity of the atmosphere versus a myriad of the other highly complicated mechanisms that we're learning more and more about every day. That's, to me, not to be confused with the fact that the root cause is a fundamental change in the heat transfer dynamics of the planet, largely caused by anthropogenic sources. I know that because I haven't read the study, but I would love to be sent a copy of it.
Very good. Let me ask another question. This question comes from one of our close friends, a loyal supporter of the university, who is a technologist. And he's asking a two-part question. He's asking several questions. I'm summarizing them in the form of a two-part question. The first part has to do with solar technologies, and the second part, the contrast between natural gas and nuclear. So the first part, he's saying, in hindsight, was installing solar panels on utility poles an idea you would do again? And let me read the second part also, and let you answer both of them. How do you quantify the fact that natural gas can be turned on and off while nuclear is base load?
Okay. So those are excellent questions. So the answer to the first question is probably not. I think its benefit was that it heightened the visibility of solar energy and the role it might be able to play in the future. It clearly was not a low-cost way to deploy solar energy. The only way that makes sense to deploy solar energy in New Jersey, and even this requires subsidization, is a large-scale grid-connected deployment of multiple megawatts. Each of those solar panels that you see on a pole is a couple of hundred watts. So it was not an economic decision. It was something that we thought could help a local New Jersey company get started, and they would be able to deploy that technology in other places where the solar resource was greater, and it would stimulate job creation. Unfortunately, that did not happen. In terms of nuclear being baseload versus natural gas being dispatchable, the nuclear baseload issue only becomes a problem because of this flaw that we have in the market, where we pay renewable power well above market through contracts that are required by government, but then we allow the renewable supplier to participate in the market as if they are a zero-cost option. What that tends to do in certain areas, this has happened mostly in Texas and the Midwest and not so much in our area, is that has forced power prices to actually go negative. So if you're a wind farm and you're eligible for a 2 cents per kilowatt hour production tax credit, and the grid operator says, I don't need you, you turn around and say, I'll tell you what, I'll pay you, grid operator, 1 cent per kilowatt hour if you let me run. Because if I don't run, I don't get the 2 cents from my tax credit. That negative price, right, where you actually have the generator paying the customer to operate, is painful for the nuclear plant, which cannot cycle, or doesn't like to cycle, certainly. I mean, you could lower it, but you can't do it quickly. So then the nuclear plant undergoes tremendous economic damage because it's literally paying somebody to take its power, and it's not free to run. It has a fuel cost. And eventually what that did in parts of the country is it forced the closure of nuclear plants, which oddly enough because of the lack of dispatchability of wind, then required the construction of natural gas plants. So you see the absurdity. We create a subsidy in the form of a production tax credit to encourage carbon-free energy. Wind farms get built in excess because of this subsidy. That results in negative price signals, resulting in the shutdown of nuclear plants, which are then replaced by natural gas plants because they have better dispatchability profiles. If we simply had a price on carbon, then the nuclear plant would have continued to operate on the baseload, and we would not have created this extremely large production tax credit benefit for the wind farm. So yes, the dispatchability of gas plants is an advantage over nuclear. However, the carbon attributes of gas plants are a bigger disadvantage, and nuclear would do well in the presence of that competition. I think, Nariman, if it's okay, I'll pick up where I left off, and then hopefully we have more questions.
And I'll go quiet for now.
No problem. So yeah, if we have the next slide. So I think I left off talking about how much we're spending on renewables and how little output comes from renewables. So that's really precious little to show for the money and time that we've invested. So we do need to do more. And that really begins with places like Stevens, where we need to have increased investment in research and development to help increase the availability and affordability of renewable energy technology and storage. I have tremendous faith in the ability of science and technology and research to further drive those prices down and to have, therefore, create greater deployment potential for solar, wind, and energy storage. And once we're able to overcome these real obstacles, I think that renewables will spread even more quickly than they have in an economically efficient way. Now, like every one of the 5 things I'm about to describe, renewables alone can't get us to our goals. So I would argue that if we're looking for a power supply that's safe, reliable, and produces zero harmful emissions, then we should seriously consider the preservation of our existing nuclear power plants. So next slide, please. So today's nuclear fleet produces about 20% of the electricity we consume in the United States. And when it comes to carbon-free energy, nuclear is responsible for about 55% of the carbon-free energy in the United States. Next slide, please. Now in New Jersey, that picture is even richer than that. Nuclear energy plays quite a bit more of a significant role. It's roughly 1/3 to 35% of the electricity generated in the state, and it represents more than 90% of our state's carbon-free energy supply. But rather than establishing nuclear energy as a national priority and investing in nuclear plants as a critical clean energy resource, instead we're seeing nuclear plants go out of business, and simply because energy markets are structured to favor cheap electricity over clean electricity without this price on carbon, and also by subsidizing renewables with out-of-market payments and pretending that they're free when they really aren't. So as I mentioned at the start, this natural gas will set the price for electricity, and historically low natural gas prices means that the markets aren't providing the revenue necessary to keep nuclear plants alive and cover their costs. Plus you have some of these anomalies, such as I mentioned a moment ago, related to wind and the production tax credit. Now the long-term climate implications of this are significant. Since 2013 alone, 7 US nuclear reactors have shut down permanently. And there are more than a dozen others that have announced that they may be forced to retire, some of them decades before their licenses are set to expire. Those 12 at-risk nuclear plants combined produce 90 million megawatt hours of electricity each year. That's more than all of the solar generation in the United States since 2017. And when nuclear plants close, we know what will happen because we've seen it happen before in places such as California, Vermont, and Germany. And we've seen it right here in New Jersey with the retirement of the Oyster Creek nuclear plant in 2018. Carbon emissions go up. In New Jersey, they went up by 3.1 million tons in just 1 year because the electricity that would have been generated by Oyster Creek was instead generated by the PJM grid and its heavy dependence on fossil fuels. And this has played itself out in so many other markets as well. So we also know that in addition to climate impacts being worse and carbon emissions going up, we know that electricity costs rise as well. And that's to be expected. The simple laws of economics say that when you remove so much supply from the market and you don't do anything to change demand, customers will in fact pay more. Now, we are fortunate that in New Jersey, state lawmakers and our regulators at the Board of Public Utilities understand the value of nuclear energy to the state's electric customers and to our carbon reduction goals. So to help keep the state's nuclear plants operating, policymakers in New Jersey created a zero emission certificate program, ZECs for short, if you will, which provides economic support for nuclear by compensating nuclear plants for the clean carbon-free electricity they provide in a way that today's energy markets do not. Next slide, please. The support provided under the ZEC program is capped at $10 per megawatt hour. That's to be compared with the $60 per megawatt hour for offshore wind and the $200 per megawatt hour for rooftop solar. So this implies a carbon cost of about $18 per ton, which is far less for the other two that I mentioned a moment ago, and far below what the social cost of carbon is as suggested by the National Academy of Sciences. But not every state that has nuclear plants shares in New Jersey's good fortune, which is why so many plants remain at risk of closing while still able to produce the carbon-free energy that I think we can agree is so important. Now, I want to be clear, it's the marketplace that's the culprit here, not natural gas. And let me explain what I mean by that. Today's energy markets were designed to recognize and reward one attribute above all others: short-term marginal costs. That means the market values electricity that is cheap. That is not a bad thing. Affordable power makes for a stronger economy. But we have to be clear as to how we define what constitutes cheap and this notion of short-term costs versus longer-term externalities. Because we've entered a period in which society, and that includes consumers, businesses, and legislators, have told us that there are other priorities such as clean air and climate change, which calls for this carbon-free generation, the pricing of this externality. So today's market continues to see energy prices driven to historic lows, and those low energy prices are so low that they're driving other generators, both coal and nuclear, out of business. Coal is being driven out of the market isn't a horrible loss because it doesn't meet society's long-term desire for clean energy. But the loss of nuclear energy is a problem. Those energy prices are driving nuclear plants into the early retirement, only to see them replaced by plants that run on fossil fuels, natural gas primarily. Is that the result of a market that's serving the public interest? I don't think so. Now, there are a number of strategies out there to correct this flaw, and the most common to date are a patchwork of subsidies provided by individual states in places such as New Jersey, New York, Ohio, and Illinois to compensate the nuclear plants for their carbon-free attributes. Pennsylvania also is considering a program of its own, although it has not committed to one. And again, I know I'm coming across as a broken record here. As I mentioned earlier, a more desirable solution will be to simply set a national price on carbon. And if the nuclear plant can't compete at the social cost of carbon impact that the National Academy or some other number is determined to be palatable, then they should close. I wouldn't argue that they should continue to be subsidized. Next slide, please. So whichever solution we choose to implement, our national priority for nuclear should be to preserve this existing fleet and keeping today's plants up and running. Every nuclear plant that closes represents an enormous step backward in our clean energy initiatives. And we should also be doing whatever we can to explore new sources of nuclear energy, including new technologies and designs such as SMR, small modular reactors, or alternate fuel cycles. But while we consider ways to develop new carbon-free energy sources and to preserve those we already have, we should also consider the value of reducing our demand for power in the first place. So next slide, we finally get to my favorite topic. So energy efficiency. So remember that quiz earlier, right? I don't believe anyone would have raised their hand if we had been in public and said that they woke up this morning looking forward to using a kilowatt hour of electricity. So I would describe energy efficiency as the low-hanging fruit of climate strategies. This is the easy, no-brainer work. It's not to suggest that it's not as effective or important as other carbon reduction tools. In fact, quite the contrary. Energy efficiency covers an array of changes that every customer can make right now that bear results immediately, whether they're a residential, commercial, or big industrial customer, whether they're wealthy, middle class, or low income, whether they live in a house or a multifamily building. And let's not forget, energy efficiency is a unique strategy and that it also helps customers save money on their utility bills. Nationwide, energy efficiency already saves consumers some $90 billion a year. Over time, that translates to a per household savings of $460 a year, according to one estimate. The more efficiency we add, the more customers are able to save while adding fewer carbon emissions to the atmosphere. Next slide, please. Now, because energy efficiency helps customers save money, the cost to implement energy efficiency programs over time balances out to zero or a negative price on carbon. It starts with simple fixes: caulking drafty windows, adding insulation, replacing old light bulbs with new higher efficient lighting, such as LEDs, turning down your thermostat when you're at work, programming it for when you go to bed at night. Next slide, please. We know that investing in energy efficiency works. Investments in energy efficiency made since 1990 have helped the United States to avoid the building of 313 large coal-fired power plants. Oh, I guess we're one slide ahead of where I wanted to be. Sorry about that. Allowing utilities to take the lead in providing energy efficiency programs, it's without doubt a proven strategy. And with the right kind of regulatory support, utilities can promote energy efficiency in a way that helps ensure universal access so that every individual can have a chance to make an impact, to make choices and investments that will reduce their household energy use, saving money, saving energy, and reducing their carbon footprint. This is where utilities such as PSEG can lend a hand, such as helping customers at large choose and install the most efficient appliances when it's time to buy or replace a refrigerator, water heater, or furnace. Next slide, please. So New Jersey, unfortunately, currently ranks 34th among states for energy efficiency savings, according to the American Council for an Energy Efficiency Economy. Other states are saving 6 times the amount of energy New Jersey is able to, because those states have empowered utilities to treat energy, to lead in terms of their energy efficiency programs. However, I am euphoric to be able to report that just 2 weeks ago, on September 23rd, the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities approved a landmark energy efficiency program that we proposed that gives our state a chance to leapfrog its way among the national leaders in energy savings. The program is part of a wide-ranging clean energy future proposal that we've made, and over 3 years, it now gives our utility the tools to help customers. By investing over $1 billion over the next 3 years, we will help customers reduce their electricity consumption by 2% and their gas usage by 0.75% per year. That will avoid 8 million metric tons of carbon emissions. It will be done while creating 4,300 jobs just in time to help New Jersey's economy partially recover from COVID-19. And most importantly, that $1 billion investment will produce $2+ billion in gross energy savings and $1 billion in net energy savings. I just have to repeat that. Bills go down by $1 billion, over 4,000 jobs get created, and carbon emissions are reduced by 8 million tons for a price on carbon of negative $125 per ton. When states like New Jersey give their utilities a role in energy efficiency, we can make sure that these tools are available to every customer, no matter what kind of housing they live in or how much money they make, for the greatest possible energy savings with the greatest potential benefit for the environment and climate. Next slide, please. But even the most aggressive energy efficiency program can't cut our electric consumption to zero, which is why we need to ensure that the power plants we do use to generate electricity can do so while having as little impact on the environment and climate as possible. By the same token, concentrating on the energy industry alone won't allow us to reach our carbon reduction goals. Next slide, please. Until now, I have focused exclusively on solutions in the power sector, but generally electricity accounts for only about a quarter, roughly 28% of the US greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, now transportation is #1 in terms of its contributions to greenhouse gases at 29%. Next slide, please. Now, thanks to the clean energy provided by New Jersey's nuclear power plants, transportation has been the #1 source of carbon emissions in the state for decades, unlike in the rest of the nation where it just recently became the #1 source. And as the rest of the country moves away from coal and towards more natural gas and renewables, that trend will continue nationwide as well. So New Jersey, like many states in the Northeast, is ripe for electrification of transportation. We have a high population density, high per capita income, poor air quality, a challenging mass transportation system, and short commuting distances. So shifting transportation from gasoline-powered vehicles to electric plug-ins would drastically help reduce greenhouse gas emissions coming from New Jersey. It's such an enormous undertaking, however, with so many touch points, convincing consumers to buy electric vehicles, solving range anxiety by building out charging stations, converting entire fleets of trucks, trains, and buses from gas to electric power. That's impossible to put a price on the cost per ton of carbon at this stage. What's more, electrification and decarbonization is a long-term strategy that can be applied more widely to homes and commercial buildings as well. As our power supply becomes cleaner, then at that point, electrification, shifting from gas to electricity for everyday uses, such as transportation, heating, or cooking, will reduce carbon emissions even further. So improvement to the electrical grid have had a massive ripple effect on hundreds of millions of items. Every device, appliance, or vehicle that runs on electricity benefits from the grid's every incremental improvement. Next slide, please. So naturally, increased electrification would drastically increase the demand for electricity, increasing the importance of getting the first 4 items on the list right: energy efficiency to keep our consumption in check, greening the generation fleet to ensure that we meet increasing demand without increasing our impact on the environment, and of course, electrifying transportation would all help. Next slide, please. Oops. Yeah, thank you. So there's no question that energy efficiency will be pivotal in driving the change in America's energy sector. Its clean energy effects are greater than any other solution, as I've shown, and it is far less expensive. Preservation of the nuclear fleet, combined with continued investment in renewable sources, would ensure our supplies of clean, carbon-free energy would increase alongside the increases in demand created by the electrification of vehicles, appliances, and machinery. And a national price on carbon would provide the policy foundation necessary to drive the economy away from carbon-heavy fuels towards greater reliance on cleaner technologies and generation sources. In short, we have historically relied on all the above strategy to build reliability and resiliency into our grid. Now, with these 5 things, we can employ the same multi-layered strategy to achieve our decarbonized future. And with that, I think I will turn to you, Nariman, for any questions that may still be out there. And thank you for your attention and time.
Ralph, this has been absolutely fascinating. You spoke so fast. I'm still trying to absorb all of these things that you said. But the graphics and the slides were so easy to follow, and your message is very succinct and very powerful, and I will surely remember these five things. Now, when it comes to questions, I've got many of them. There are a total of 32 questions. Some of them are real questions, some of them are comments. I'll try to go over the questions as best I could, and I will do my best to give you a diversity of issues as opposed to dwelling on one topic. So let me go through these one by one, and whenever you run out of time, please let me know. Here is a question that I'm going to read because it's well articulated. There are some concerns that market forces alone will not drive us to decarbonization quickly enough, as market forces are often driven by profit and are subject to economic forces. Would you support a concerted and comprehensive effort by the federal government to transition the entire United States economy to decarbonization before 2050, regardless of market forces and without regard to profitability and cost?
So the short answer to that is I would prefer not doing it without market forces. My fear is, so a counter to market forces and a price on carbon that many people are champions of are, let's just create clean energy standards. let's regulate a certain percentage of technology A, B, and C. Sadly, I think what that tends to do is reflect not so much economically efficient decisions as it does the lobbying power of technology A, B, and C. And I think that that hurts consumers. Now, despite my passion for climate change, there are many parts of America that struggle to put a third meal on the table, that struggle to pay their rent. So that's why I didn't want to simply say at any cost. I do think that there is a way to put a price on carbon that's high enough to have a meaningful impact to achieve our climate change goals, and then to take that tax, so it's not a profit to any company, it's a tax on the carbon emitter, and recycle it. Recycle it to low-income folks who can barely pay their meals today. Recycle it into deficit reduction. Recycle it into our infrastructure. Recycle it in a way that provides a social good. I am a big fan of making people pay heavy taxes for bad things like climate change and not taxing them for good things like wealth creation. So I think that the questioner is right to say that we want to act aggressively, but I think the market is the most efficient allocator of resources when it gets a fair pricing.
Very good. If you don't mind, I'm going to actually pose a question of my own.
Sure, of course.
It's about nuclear power. Obviously, I'm not an energy specialist, but I do know that in Europe, in a large, prosperous country like France, they have done a terrific job of increasing the reliance of their energy production on nuclear. Yeah, I believe a little more than 70% of electricity in France is produced out of nuclear energy. And they've done a terrific job of ensuring safety over many, many decades. Another technologically advanced country right adjacent to France, Germany, which is oftentimes a technology leader, is moving exactly in the opposite direction. I think only 10% or maybe slightly more than 10% of their electricity comes out of nuclear. And in fact, they're reducing the percentage. Can you tell me what is your opinion as to why these two adjacent countries have such a different policy in deploying nuclear?
Yeah, sadly, I think it's much more of a political than a science challenge. And in that respect, I don't want to claim expertise, but what you have, because of the size of the nuclear industry in France, you had a very, very strong labor contingent that appropriately wielded its economic clout. A much smaller, but not immaterial nuclear industry in Germany succumbed to a very strong green movement, literally called the Green Party. But I thought they were foolish, to be honest. Once Germany invested heavily in rooftops, in solar installations, mostly rooftop, and they began to back away from their nuclear plants, they realized that they could not preserve the reliability of the system. And they had to start relying upon lignite coal to produce electricity. And you know, now that fortunately they've realized that that's a crazy thing to do, but they're at risk of some geopolitical instability by having to import natural gas from Russia. So there's no question from a climate point of view, what Germany did was not the right step to take. But there are obviously other socio-political implications that dominated their thinking that I wouldn't profess to be expert in, that pushed them in that direction. But from the point of view of climate change, they made the wrong decision.
Thank you. There is one individual who's posed many, many questions, some very technical, but I'll read one of the questions for you. Is PSEG working on endpoint models that are flexible and include existing and proposed technologies such as hydrogen?
So we are not. So PSEG does not view itself as an R&D organization. Candidly, we are happy to fund programs at places that are good at that, like Stevens. We do that in our self-interest. We want to be viewed as the type of place that your faculty members will say to your bright students, you should think about PSEG. They're a progressive company. They're a good company. And of course, we are in some specific cases, we do turn to faculty members for consulting help on specific projects. But in general, we're not a research organization nor a development organization. We do monitor developments through Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, and we are monitoring the evolution of hydrogen as a viable storage technology, of course, through those pathways. But in general, our hallmark is reliability, so we would not be on the cutting edge, or some people say, forgive the analogy, the bleeding edge of technology. We would want to be the, if not the beta site, maybe the omega site for a new technology.
Do you have time for another couple questions?
Yes.
Okay, so this one is interesting. What are the alignments of the financial incentives for PSEG to reduce consumer energy usage? As a publicly traded company, what incentivizes PSEG or any other power company to reduce consumer power expenses rather than maximize revenue from consumers?
Yeah, that's a great question. And people have trouble understanding this answer, but I'm sure with this audience, there won't be a problem. So think of what PSEG charges customers for are two things. It's fixed costs and it's variable costs. Its variable costs are essentially fuel. If we could put in place a device, a light bulb, a programmable thermostat, such that over its life, the cost to the customer is less than the variable cost of serving that customer, then we can charge the customer our fixed cost plus the cost of the new device and save the customer money. Who loses in that? The fuel company. We're not a fuel company. We don't mine uranium-235. We don't dig for coal. We don't extract natural gas. And in fact, energy efficiency is such a low-hanging fruit. Sadly, the flip side of that coin is the United States and New Jersey are such energy hogs that we can easily recover our fixed costs plus the cost of the technology and a profit on that and still lower the customer's bill. And that's that. Now, it does cannibalize our power plants, but that's okay. We're willing to do that because by this time next year, the only power plants we'll have are our nuclear plants, and those are base load. So they're not at risk of shutting down from a load demand point of view.
Very good. I've got three other questions that I think would be of interest to the audience, so I'll quickly cover them.
Okay.
The first one, will the extensive adoption of zero-emission vehicles impact PSEG's electricity grid operation, and will significant upgrade of PSEG's grid be necessary?
So the answer is there will be a growth in electricity demand as a result. We don't think that growth will be a problem from the point of view of overall system size. We are concerned with the time of use and whether it worsens our load factor. And as you know, the system is designed for the peak. So the more peaked we make the demand, the worse asset utilization we have, and the more challenging it becomes to serve the customer. So I think, but we can remedy that with some time of use pricing or some variable pricing that modifies consumer behavior.
Terrific. Next question, as PSEG will deploy its energy efficiency programs, will your priority be placed on residential or commercial consumers?
Yeah, so it's primarily residential, small commercial, and then some institutional customers, hospitals, government offices, things of that nature. Generally speaking, large energy users are very sophisticated about their energy use and have already made many of these investments. So it'll be mostly down market. And candidly, I'm happy about that because those tend to be the customers who pay the least attention to it and can least afford to pay. So I'm happy we'll be able to help them.
Excellent.
I think in the interest of your time and everyone else's, maybe we'll just take one more and then leave it to you to wrap up, if that's okay. Exactly,
right. There's just one more left. And this is actually probably more a comment than a question, but if you think it's a question that you can respond to, you should. And it says, for every 2 watts of nuclear generation, there are 3 watts of waste heat generated.
Yeah.
First of all, I don't know if this is true. If it is true, what are the implications?
You know, I suspect, I don't know if that's true or not, but realize that that's just simply a fair criticism, if it is true, and let's assume it is, of the complete wasted amount of energy that's still in the fuel rods that we dispose of. So for years, the industry has talked about fuel reprocessing, but we've met with political and regulatory resistance to that. By the way, of course, this audience is sophisticated enough to know that for every unit of energy produced from a fossil fuel plant, there's 2 units of energy that's wasted in the form of waste heat as well, just limited by Carnot efficiency or other thermodynamic limitations. So yes, no one has invented a perfect fuel process quite yet, an energy conversion process quite yet. But thank you so much for allowing me to do this, Nariman, and for the audience's question. I'm terribly sorry that we didn't get to all of them, but I just think in the interest of people's tolerance for a length of sitting in a seat and listening to me, perhaps I should turn it over to you now.
I appreciate it very much, Ralph. This has been an absolutely fascinating and most informative presentation. On behalf of the entire Stevens community, I thank you for giving us your time and sharing with us your experience and your wisdom. Unfortunately, you cannot hear the roaring sound of applause in the back of the room, but we're immensely grateful. So to wrap up, I'd like to make a couple of announcements, if you don't mind. I am delighted to confer the 6th President's Medal upon Dr. Izzo, and I'd like to say a couple of words about this medal. The President's Medal is awarded to individuals who've had a significant impact on society by virtue of their science and technology-focused research and development activities and contributions, their entrepreneurial accomplishments, their leadership in business, education, or the public sector, their artistic or cultural contributions, or their success in elucidating critical topics for greater public understanding, policy making, and action. And you, Dr. Izzo, qualify for several of these qualifications. Today, I bestow this honor upon Dr. Izzo for his leadership and significant contributions to building energy reliability and resiliency. As further tribute to Dr. Izzo's influence, a deserving and talented incoming freshman will be selected to receive a scholarship named in your honor, Dr. Izzo, starting next fall. So we will be delighted to introduce you to the Ralph Izzo Scholar in fall of 2021. So to wrap up, it is my honor to present to you the President's Medal. Unfortunately, I guess what the picture that you see here, do you see this upside down?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so I guess I should display it like that. That is the box, but there is actually a medal. And this is the beautiful medal. The President's Medal bestowed upon Dr. Ralph Izzo, October 7th, 2020. Thank you so very much, Ralph, one more time. I hope we get a chance to invite you to campus, show you around, shake your hand, and thank you in person.
Thank you so much. It was an honor.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.